for that bird.
Yeah, that particular bird you might hear.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 27 of Lean Whiskey. I'm Mark Graben. I'm indoors. We're joined by
Jamie Flenchball. I'm outdoors, and good morning, Mark.
Good morning. Now, people might wonder. Well, for one, they're gonna hear the birds, and it sounds like a golf broadcast a little bit in the background. So that's cool.
It could be.
And people may be wondering, okay, no. You guys have not progressed to drinking whiskey in the morning now. What's going on?
Right. I like to say that there's two legitimate reasons that people don't think twice about drinking in the morning, and one is tailgating, and the other is travel, airline travel, particularly. Yeah. But this is not enough of a good reason. So we're not actually drinking whiskey today. We are drinking coffee, and not Irish coffee.
No, exactly. Well, that would be a different thing. I mean, hey, to each their own. Yeah, I mean, I guess we've all. I didn't make a habit of that when I was traveling for business. The morning Bailey's in the coffee, like some business travelers do. I try not to judge, but yeah, tailgate party. I'm hoping to get back to that this fall up at Northwestern.
Right. No, those are good reasons, but yeah, we decided even though we were recording in the morning, we're actually recording in the morning in part on purpose because we wanted to do a coffee episode. We both started doing pour over coffee at home. Thought we'd compare some notes. And so we're both doing pour over coffee this morning. It's an interesting, I don't want to say trend, because it certainly is a trend, but at the same time, it's a throwback to how many people used to. My father-in-law used a Chemex like I'm using every day, and so it's a throwback. It's also a current trend. Although I think what people are doing today with it is definitely different than some of the throwback from being very artisanal and craft oriented in making their coffee. And I think that's where the crossover between the whiskey culture and the coffee culture starts to come into play.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about the process of making this and some of the tools and gear that we've used a little bit today. So I poured mine. I made mine a couple minutes before the episode. I just poured it out of a travel mug. And for those watching on YouTube, that looks like coffee, right? I'm not using the coffee mug that says this might be bourbon. It's right. Coffee, unadulterated.
Mine's very easy to tell.
But we've got visibility into Jamie's through a clear mug to those who are just listening. But before we get into the process, I was going to say, though, just going back to when we started this podcast, at one point, the concept was taking the lean coffee meeting format and doing that, but over whiskey. And we ended up not really following that format. Jamie and I don't have the Post-it notes with the topics and the 5-minute timer and all of that. But some of the spirit of it, pun intended, is meant to be the same, of touching on different topics and doing it over a beverage in a friendly way.
Yeah, and I think lean coffee, which has become quite popular as sort of regional networks or at conferences and even inside companies. But it's sort of, just like that caffeine of the coffee, it's high octane, high caffeinated, quick flow, highly regimented. And so our lean whiskey is in some ways the opposite, right? Low to no flow, very casual. Even if we only cover one topic, we're okay. No time limits. So we're not going to flip formats today, even though we are flipping beverages. And
we're flipping the time of day because this is about 12 hours out of sync from when we normally do it.
That it is, and we'll see if our minds are fresher and our although this is a Sunday and we both probably had yesterday was World Whiskey Day or National Whiskey Day? I can't remember.
I think it was World Whiskey Day. A friend of mine from Scotland was posting about that, so I will trust that he was correct about that.
He was correct.
He's in the industry. He knows what he's doing. I did have a little bit of. I'm here in Texas, and I'm repping the Garrison Brothers shirt today. I did have some of our friend David Meyer's Glens Creek OCD number 5 premium last night.
Very good. Very good. I made myself the first mixed drink of a summer season. I don't tend to do that as much in the winter, and just neat is plenty good for me. But it was did a lot of outdoor yard work, and I felt a cooler beverage was in order. But I definitely had a couple of different whiskeys in my evening last night, so coffee was inevitable anyway. Yeah.
So cheers and slancha and chin chin and kampai and what have you. But so let's talk about coffee. And I'm curious, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're drinking and where, as we typically would do. And then we're also going to talk about how we made it, or at least how we did the final preparation. So Jamie, if you want to share first.
Yeah, so I'll again, there's a lot of different ways to do this, and there's definitely some ingredients to making this work. But I'm using Death Wish coffee, which is an interesting coffee. It's highly caffeinated, but it's still very rich and has lots of flavor and tones to it. I generally use it more for my espresso, and I use different actually decaf beans often for my over, and I'll do both of those in the morning. But and I have some new coffee showing up, I think, tomorrow. But using Death Wish coffee, I have a new coffee grinder that KitchenAid makes that is really fantastic. Not only does how it work very excellent, but I'll say two features. It really has one of the most narrow streams of coffee grinds coming out that makes it very easy to control and not get sloppy. Mm-hmm. And that's a feature that matters. It's also has a nice, satisfying guttural sound to the motor versus the high-pitched whir that most have. And the grinder, I think, is perhaps more important than your actual pour-over gear. Really kind of controlling that and getting that right.
Because what you're going for is a consistency in the size of the grind.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Consistency in the size from one batch to the next, but also within your batch. So if you have a bunch of different grind sizes in your batch of coffee, it's going to get different extractions from different granules. So so from a process standpoint, I have a Chemex. This is the classic throwback 1950s. Chemex, never really been changed process with paper filters.
Okay, and Chemex is the brand of that.
Chemex is the brand, and has a very specific feel to it from again how it's been styled and manufactured for decades, and works quite well. Uses paper filters, which is a downside, but I'll say from an environmental standpoint. But at the same time, there are some advantages to kind of what the paper controls. But real quick on my process is, I wet the filter, pour out the water actually while I'm doing the grind. So I'm really getting the freshest grind. Then I pour over to get what's called the bloom, which is allowing the gas to escape, because you don't want the gas is escaping while the water is trying to go into the coffee. It works against itself. And
I think it's carbon dioxide. It's the same thing if you're making with French press process, and you actually see it kind of swell a little bit, which is kind of fun to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the French press, it's just brute force, right? You're just shoving the coffee in there and the water in there, and you just let it sit.
Steeps. Yeah,
it just steeps, and it's been my most common past practice because it does give you a thorough coffee. But once you get the bloom to settle, usually about 30 seconds, then you keep a steady pour of hot water until you get until you're finished. And generally, the purpose of this whole process, which I actually timed today, takes about 10 minutes for me from beginning to end, is it's not as much brute force. It is more nuanced, and you definitely get more of the flavor notes of the coffee, which only matters if you're using, coffee beans that are freshly ground and well properly roasted and, has something worth tasting.
Right.
So otherwise you don't do a pour over with a Folgers because it's just, there's no point to it. So
probably not. Not a sponsor, so we don't have sponsors. I'm not really looking for that big old can of Folgers or Maxwell House anyway. That's of a different era. But yeah, you're right. Like the process of making the pour over is interesting. I mean, it's not quite a Japanese traditional green tea ceremony, but almost.
No,
it has a lot involved.
It has some of that feel to it. And I think we'll come back to this, I think, but, to me, that's part of the value is that ritual, including making the espresso, which is, it's part of the ritual. It's the tamp and the swipe and the polish and all the things that come with it. So it is a little bit about the control over the product, right? You can't get a good product without some human focus and execution, and that's part of the craft that I think has some appeal.
And later in the episode, we're going to talk about inventory and supply chain. I mean, as with manufacturing, if you're not procuring good components to your beverage, garbage in, garbage out, maybe from a quality perspective. So I'll talk how I've got slightly different equipment, but I think the thing that first, I think caught my attention with pour over coffee, 5 or 6 years ago, was to think of going to a coffee shop. I'm normally a black coffee drinker, so the comments or the money advice about your $5 a day latte habit, not quite the same thing when it's black coffee, $2. Now with the pour over, I think there's a couple of things that come into the pricing where you could then easily end up paying $5 or $6 or $7 for a cup of coffee at a craft local coffee shop. But maybe there's a better quality of bean. The process, I think certainly like that, to me, that's a cup of coffee I want to sit and enjoy in the coffee shop without a lid, right? Because I'm getting the aromas and there's that experience. I'm clearly not in a rush. If I'm willing to order, I'm not going to just slap a lid on it and drink it in the car. And then there's the labor component of it. So it is more expensive to produce. I mean, prices, I think, being driven by the market and what people are willing to pay. I'm willing to pay that. And I wanted to start experimenting at home, though, because you can do this with your own labor much more cheaply at home. So, you've got tools, right? So I started off with a digital kitchen scale because sort of like baking, at least I didn't bring the bag of coffee up to the office here, but I was using beans from a roaster in LA. It's called The Boy and the Bear. They've got a couple of locations, both roasting and the coffee shop, and they'll, of course, make a pour over there. But on these beans, which come from Colombia, they have a lot of direct farmer relationships. So there's a different supply chain issue. Like the name of the farmer is on the bag as well. And nice. I think they're trying to do right by those farmers. But on the bag, it says very specifically, they recommend doing 30 grams of coffee. So to your point, I would set up my scale, weigh out 30 ounces of beans, and then I have I've got a different model KitchenAid grinder, and they call it a Burr Grinder. So we may have all started off with the type of grinder that has just a whirling blade inside a container area. Well, that really pulverizes and heats up the coffee, and the grind's not going to be real consistent. So this Burr Grinder, it's more like if you were milling for whiskey production.
Right.
The beans fall down and through and get chopped and cut up into grounds. And so I did that right before making the coffee. So I've got a scale. I'm weighing out the coffee. I'm heating water. We've got a Breville brand electric kettle. Very more common to see in households, maybe in the UK, where people are making tea. And this one's sort of fancy. It was a gift for my wife, who's a tea drinker, where you can specify different precise temperatures depending on what you're making. So I have it on the French press coffee setting, just below boiling. And so that water boiled. And then I was using a pour over device that looked very similar to yours, Jamie, but it's from a brand called Bodum, which makes French presses and other devices. And it has a reusable metal filter. So I use that. And then the instructions say, again, 400 grams of water. So I've got the scale, I've reset it to 0, and now I start to pour, like you said, the 30-second bloom or so. You pour a little bit of water. So I've got the stopwatch app running on my phone. And so then, I'm kind of pouring in a circular motion. And as that thing sort of fills, I'm not doing it quite continually. I don't know if this is a problem. The end result was good. But, I kind of pour, 50 grams of water, and it kind of starts to fill. And then I let it drip through. And then as that's down, I pour a little more. And I've got, that timing works out pretty well on the bag of coffee again. So it says 30 grams of coffee, 400 grams of water, 4 minutes time to produce. So unlike the French press where it sits and steeps, here it's actually dripping through, but there's some water that gets left stuck in the grounds. So I think they're saying 4 minutes because you don't want to let it sit and drip forever.
Right.
For one, the coffee's cooling, and at some point you might start extracting more bitter over time. So there's an interesting process to it.
Yeah, and I think part of you go look to different styles of making coffee. Of course, if you're going to start, throwing a bunch of ingredients in it, syrups and all that other stuff, there's really no point to doing this. And
sure.
And I actually first, really experienced pour overs because whatever I wanted when I went to a coffee house, they didn't have. And like it could have just been decaf, like they didn't have a pot of decaf on. So it's like, well, we can do a pour over. I'm like, all right, do a pour over. And I noticed the difference. And so that was part of my experience. Now, most of my coffee over the years has been whatever machine they stick in your hotel room. Since I traveled, 3 to 4 weeks a month for 20 years, whatever equipment and beans or bags they put in your hotel room, that was usually what my coffee drinking experience was.
Pre-measured pouch, or increasingly you get K-cup Keurig machines. Right.
Yep. And so, I tended to drink coffee more as just a habit more than an experience. But with pour over, it's I do think it's very much a different product. When I compare the same stuff against a French press, the same coffee, the same even if I play around with grind size, it's a different experience in drinking it for sure. And then of course it's a different experience in making. And then of course it takes time. Takes more time than perhaps any other method of making coffee. But I think the ritual is part of the experience.
Yeah. Well, and Starbucks will do a pour over, like you said, in the middle of the day if they're out of decaf or they're out of the blonde roast, which I prefer that lighter style roast as opposed to the overly. There's a reason people sometimes refer to them as charbucks as a joke.
Oh yeah, it's consistent, but it's consistently burnt.
And you could take, bad beans, and it doesn't matter once you over roast them. I'm not saying they have bad beans. You can get light roasts at Starbucks, and there's different flavors for different people when it comes to all things.
Right.
But when you think about the time, so I think there's maybe a lean point here about batch sizes and time and quality. So you could take the same beans, and downstairs we've got the traditional drip coffee maker that'll make a 10-cup batch of coffee all at once. Now, I haven't timed that. That'll take more than 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've got a French press, which would take about the same amount of time as the pour over. By the time you grind it, let it steep for about 5 minutes. But I've got a larger French press that makes 2 cups at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So the time of making 10 cups at once, 2 cups at once in the French press, 1 cup at a time in the pour over. And then I've also got the Keurig machine, which I haven't timed it. Maybe takes 2 minutes. It's got to heat up the water and it does its thing. But I have a reusable K-cup thing where I could grind beans and put the same beans into that and say, okay, Keurig, do your thing. So I think the one lean question I'll throw back to you is, are batches always bad? Should you always make 1 cup flow, 1 cup at a time?
Yeah, and I think it all depends, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, because you have 2 different sets of batches. You have how much coffee you make at once and by what method. You have time duration, and you have time consumption, right? So your French press might take as long in duration as French press and pour over might take the same duration, but you're much more heavily involved in time consumption during the pour over method. Mm-hmm. Whereas French press, you pour it in, you go do something else, just like the K-cup, and then you come back and you have it. And then there's also the batching of the coffee, right? How big a bag do you buy? Do you buy pre-ground? If you buy pre-ground, it's part of a batch. And all my grinders come with containers that have lids on them, so you can grind a few days worth and then put the lid on, which is another way of batching. But I think it depends on what you value. If you just want a cup of coffee, then let me add another waste, right? So you have time, you also have material. Right? So I would argue from a purely experiencing a cup of coffee standpoint, from a time waste standpoint and a value added standpoint, the K-cup is the way to go. Right? But it adds material waste unless you have your refillable, in which case you've lost the time advantage.
And there's environmental impact of the K-cup, Steve, to the point where the inventor of the Keurig machine has expressed some regret over that.
Right. So,
but to your point, it depends on are you just trying to get out the door and I just want to be caffeinated? That's one set. When we come back to the question of this is Clayton Christensen's last book, The Job to Be Done. Yes. Are you trying to caffeinate yourself, or are you trying to savor and enjoy something? Those are 2 very different coffee users, if you will.
Absolutely, and much like cooking, it's do you enjoy the experience? Is the experience part of the value add, or is that just work to produce the product? Right. So, is the value add the cup of coffee? Or is the value add the experience of making the cup of coffee? And that to me is where I think pour over has and espresso, but that's also a very different type of cup of coffee. It tastes very different. But it to me, it is part of the experience. It is part of the ritual. That's part of the value add for me. I wouldn't outsource that to somebody. I actually prefer to make my own pour over than if I had a drive-by, barista that would do a pour over for me and stick it on my desk. Yeah, the value add of making it, the craft, the ritual, that's part of the value add for me. And so I think that's why probably the right thing for the market is that there are many different solutions, because there are many different jobs to be done.
Yep. And when you think about, so one key point think from a quality and a standard work perspective, to listeners who buy, we buy a batch of coffee, whether it's a 12-ounce bag or a 16-ounce bag. You may grind some of it as a batch, but the key point that experts say, don't store your coffee in the freezer or the fridge, because there's no need to refrigerate it. It's going to pick up moisture, I think, if you put it in the freezer, and it could pick up odors from food. So if you're using I think that's one tip. Just leave it out on the counter in a sealed bag or a canister or something. But when I think of the job to be done and batch sizes, there are different use cases. There's me making a cup of coffee for the podcast here. There's if I was making coffee for the family, for a family gathering, I'm not going to do one pour over cup at a time, nor would, let's say, my wife or my in-laws appreciate that. Like, no, they might not. If they're going to put, some of them are going to put cream in it, or some of them don't really care about the coffee so much. It's just a morning habit and caffeination drill. So I would probably make, if it was just a couple of cups, I would probably use the French press. And if I was really having a large gathering, I'm going to brew a big batch of coffee because it's going to get consumed. Right, the thing that got me away from the traditional, let's say, 10-cup coffee maker is I would make a batch, and then it either sits there and gets stale, or I have a brewer with a metal carafe that keeps the coffee warm, so it's not getting heated by that burner, with the bad gas station coffee or the bad break room coffee that just gets burnt to death. But I would end up dumping out 2/3 or a half of what I made. So that did lead me to some smaller batch coffee solutions. And I will admit to using the Keurig at times, not always with the reusable K-cup. It's part of my environmental load, if you will. But I think different solutions for different needs.
Yeah. And Easter with family over, we, I made a French press and maybe even two of them. But I still enjoy for anybody interested and willing. Yeah, I'll go make the espresso for you and let you share that experience. And it's extra work, but again, it's a shared experience at that point. Just like whiskey is whiskey with a friend is a different experience than whiskey by yourself. There's a reason that, Starbucks became a third choice destination besides work and home, is because people used it as a social experience. And as much, the coffee was only a component of it. And it just became a common place for people to meet, to work, to interview. I can't tell you how many places, how times I would see people being interviewed in a Starbucks, so that becomes all part of the coffee culture, similar to the whiskey culture, which is there's many different. It's both the product and it's the experience.
Yeah. So, anything else you want to say about coffee? My coffee is still really hot 30 minutes after making it, so I'm still enjoying.
Mine's getting a little cooler. I probably have one more pour out of my container, and I will finish it. But then I have a decaf iced coffee, in the as a backup when I'm done.
All right, so before we talk about inventory and supply chain questions of different types, I'm going to throw a curveball at you, Jamie. So you had commented the other day something about, I don't know if this was on Instagram, or that you'd never seen me wear a hat.
Yeah, you're right.
Something to that effect. I forgot what triggered that.
There's so much about your style that is, I don't want to say iconic, but is how Mark looks.
Okay. How I look. Okay.
It's how I expect Mark to look.
Sure.
And I guess there was a post about many hats or something like that.
That's what it was. Proverbial career hats. Yeah.
Yeah. The many hats of Mark, and you are very diversified and sort of, I'll say, a parallel entrepreneur is what I like to refer to it as.
Sure.
But many different projects going on at once, many different hats. And I think that was the post that I commented on. And I probably have seen you in a hat, but
no, probably
it just wasn't.
Probably not.
Maybe I haven't. And it was just wasn't the picture I had in mind. So
today,
here you've got a hat on.
So those who are just listening won't see this, but I'm wearing, I'm feeling very Texas-y today. I'm in Texas. I'm drinking LA coffee that I brought back with me, but I've got my Garrison Brothers shirt. My hat is from Billy Bob's, Texas, Fort Worth, famed honky tonk and concert venue. But here, this is going to be a surprise for you, Jamie. I think I'm going to do that the second half of the episode with this hat.
Here we go. Now we're Texas.
And before I do that, part of why I'm wearing the hat is A, it's early. B, I need a haircut, and my hair is just ridiculous if I haven't just taken a shower. And
I do not. These are problems I do not have.
I wasn't trying to rub that in. So look at this.
There you go. Now you're Texas.
I got myself a cowboy hat that we'll post a picture. We'll take a screen grab and post a picture. I am, as they say in Texas, all hat and no cattle. Like I feel,
you do not have any cattle.
I feel fraudulent wearing this. I mean, it fits. I'll leave it on. It goes with the Garrison Brothers motif.
It does. It does. I can't think of the last time I had a cowboy hat. I was probably a kid. I'm not going to go get a fedora, which is probably more of my style. Or a newsboy cap.
I was going to say that's like a English football coach might wear, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I could maybe pull off a cowboy hat, ironically, but it's I definitely don't have enough Texas in me for that. So, but
I don't know if I'm wearing the hat ironically. I feel fraudulent. Well,
you are currently a Texan, and you've been there quite a long time. So I think it's fair. I think it's a fair choice. There's very few Texans who have cattle. So
yeah, that's true. And as a point of process, you're supposed to grab the hat by the crown so you don't screw up the bend of the hat. I think I can tip the hat like that. So. All right, so we're going to talk about supply chain and inventory concepts here. There's a number of articles that caught our attention that I think are interconnected in different ways, like on the theme of inventory and supply chain. So just to throw a couple of them out there, there's been a lot in the news again recently that, the death of just in time. I think we've talked about this before, so this won't be the main point, but that's been back in the news again. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about how supposedly Toyota is putting the brakes on just in time because of some semiconductor chip issues. And the point I tried to make, and Jeff Liker wrote something really good on the LEI website, is that Toyota's not moving away from just in time. There have always been certain suppliers and certain components because of distance and variation where they would hold more inventory. Toyota is pragmatic, not dogmatic, and I tried, I was trying to be nice and not super snarky, but I tweeted at the reporter from the Wall Street Journal who was basically a jerk about it. He was defensive. Well, I talked to Toyota. Okay, so you know more than Jeff Liker. Great, good luck with that. So,
yeah, I'm not sure who he talked to. I'm sure not the guy running supply chain design. But I think that what was interesting is the first article that I think got us headed down this path, because you and I have always gone back and forth every time, the just-in-time stuff comes up in the news. It's poorly reported and lacks. I actually saw one from The Economist, who I generally respect, and it was all about the Suez Canal and and it was it really kind of missed the point. And we'll talk about healthcare supplies, but the since we weren't drinking whiskey, we still did have a whiskey news article in some sense, which is which is the 10 million bourbon barrels that are, I think that is resting, right? That is aging.
Which I'd argue is a value added. That's a value added process while it's in the barrel.
By definition, right?
Yes.
It is value added. Now, what's interesting, just as a quick aside on this, is that this is where you age the barrel, matters, because if whether it's the state you age it in, or we get to Jefferson's Reserve Ocean where it's on a boat and sloshing around, and that changes things, or if it's on the top floor of the rick house or the bottom floor of the rick house where the temperature variation is different. But the value add in the winter is different than the value add in the summer, because the differences in the temperature. But the process of swelling and shrinking and sitting and interacting with the wood of the barrel is definitely changing the product by and for the better. Form, fit, or function. It's changing form, fit, or function of the product by absolute definition value add. But it's still inventory. There's still a lot of it. And, how do you not overshoot the market years into the future? Right.
That's the challenge here, right? So the headline says nearly 10 million barrels resting in Kentucky. Is that good? ? So I'm thinking of, the statistician Don Wheeler, who one of his expressions is, without context, data have no meaning. So we get into the article and it says the Kentucky Distillers Association released numbers which we'll assume are accurate. That's not the issue here, right? There are 2.1 million barrels filled. And so I think they filled 2 million barrels in the last year. And there are a total of almost 10 million. So there's a total barrels, almost 10 million that are aging at some point. And it says it's a record number. So that sets a little context. That's a record number. But it says here, when you talk about trying to hit market demand, we can talk a little bit about system dynamics, as we both learned and studied at MIT, or people may know from The Fifth Discipline, Peter Senge, and books like that. It is really hard when you've got long time lags to predict anything or to understand cause and effect. So if you're trying to forecast demand 4 to 10 years in advance, good luck with that. And whiskey making, by definition, can't be a really agile supply chain, right? So this article says here, if you ask the distillery owners, the liquid in at least half those barrels won't be ready to sell for years. There's 15% that could be dumped, as they say, and filtered and bottled. And that really wouldn't be enough to quench demand right now.
Right.
So what do you do about, down the road? And they are trying to find this balance of, and I know Garrison Brothers has gone through this as there have been waves in their sales. The quote unquote beer game effect has hit Garrison Brothers. But, you look at your demand for coming months, because that last leg of the supply chain of when do we bottle it and ship it, you do have control over. So you can bottle it and ship it. But as we've talked about before, whiskey does not get better in the bottle. It just sits inert.
Right.
It's not going to get bad. So you don't have that supply chain challenge. Or they can continue aging it, which could make it better, but then to a point, maybe not anymore. So there are all sorts of things that they're trying to balance. So someone else in the article said, if anything, you say we've got 10 million barrels. They said, if anything, we're concerned about a lack of supply. We don't see consumer tastes changing or things slowing down. I don't see evidence of an impending glut, but that's all a guess, right?
It's all a guess, right? Because the time frame is, are you looking at current trends? Well, it's very hard to predict taste over a 10-year time horizon, which is kind of what we're, at least talking about a 5-year time horizon. And what's interesting is that if you go back in time and look at the other end of this, where there was an overshoot only because of demand dropping. So, Scotch in the 80s was not a popular drink, right? And, we go back to that time frame and before, and people didn't drink a lot of 21-year-old Scotch, right? It was 10-year-old, 12-year-old Scotch. I'm not a big meme guy, but one of my favorites is always, no matter how cool you think you are, you'll never be as cool as Frank Sinatra stepping out of a helicopter with a glass of scotch.
So it's interesting you mentioned Frank Sinatra last night. Just interrupt real quick. We watched a documentary about Jack Daniels. Frank Sinatra was a Jack Daniels guy.
Right. Yeah. So he didn't drink, he wasn't drinking like high end stuff. Of course, he was drinking a lot of it, but but he could afford whatever he wanted and didn't even have to pay for most of his drinks. But if you look at demand dropped significantly, people moved to different beverages, and this meant that the Scotch distilleries almost had to age stuff longer,
right?
Which in some ways led to the new culture of longer age stuff. And so if that hadn't happened, if demand hadn't dropped so much that all this stuff ended up, aging longer because they didn't have a market to bottle it, they ended up with more, 18-year-old and 21-year-old and 15-year-old stuff. And did that lower the price of higher end stuff and then stoke the market's interest in higher age stuff. So hard to know for sure, but we certainly saw a huge multi-decade, really at least a couple of decade market dynamic on the other end. Not enough demand for the supply.
Yeah, because this article talks about the bottom falling out in the 60s when consumer interests shifted towards gin, vodka, tequila, and wine. And I think it's interesting in the U.S., maybe we're just drinking more. Wine consumption has increased dramatically at all ends of the wine quality and price spectrum. But people are also drinking more whiskey. So, there's just, it's hard to predict, right? They probably didn't predict bourbon and now rye becoming trendy. They missed that. So I don't know how that gives them any more certainty about, missing potentially the trend, the boom ending. So, in the past, the risk is distillers go out of business and other people buy up their supply and then blend it into something or continue aging it. Or, maybe we end up with the next Pappy Van Winkle somehow.
Right. Well, what's very hard with this market dynamic is you look at where you stage inventory, right? So with whiskey, again, you stage inventory in barrels. You stage it in bottles. You stage it at retailers. And then the added dynamic is you stage it in the hands of consumers, because more and more, and it was true of both wine, and it's always been true of wine, with cellaring. I have bottles that I don't intend to open for another 10 years.
And those continue to age and get better.
Those do continue to age and get better. Yeah. But even with whiskey, they'll find something that they like and then they buy a case of it and they tend to hang on to it, or they're hanging on to it to sell it later, which is a huge market. So, we know statistically wine and, we know more about wine and whiskey purchases going up than we actually know about wine and whiskey consumption going up, right? And so at some point, does there become a glut of inventory owned by consumers that re-enters the market in the secondary market and competes with the manufacturers?
Right. Or if there were economic problems, people might buy less and they'll draw down their personal inventory. But like I saw, they're a relatively small percentage of wine drinkers are holding inventory at home, whether that's on a shelf, a rack, a fridge, or a cellar. Like, most people are buying wine to be consumed that day or the next couple of days, which is kind of like the industry generalization. But when you talk about the different stages, so what I know of the story of Garrison Brothers, you have by law, the 3-tier distribution system. You have you've got the distiller, and then you've got the distributors, then you've got the retailer, and then you've got the consumer. So this comes back to the quote unquote beer game. the famous tabletop simulation, the MIT beer game, that is brewer, distributor, retailer, customer, right?
Yep.
There's four stages and four steps in the supply chain.
Brewer, distributor, wholesaler, retailer was the fourth one. And then there's the consumer is a deck of cards, essentially, is the consumer at the far end.
So the beer game, the punchline of the game is like, as you're playing it, only the retailer sees the little blip upward in demand, where demand goes from like 2 cases, whatever the units is, 2 cases to 4 cases. And so the retailer reacts and increases their order back upstream. And the increase gets amplified as you go further back up to the brewer. So then at the end of the game, you ask the brewer to draw a curve of what they think happened to demand, and they'll draw something wildly oscillating, where it was not oscillating at the point of retail. It just went up once. And that little blip, because of poor communication, lack of visibility, those swings get bigger and bigger upstream. So what happened to Garrison Brothers, going back a few years ago, is that they sell through their channels. They have distributors, and there's inventory, and then it goes through to retailers. And they were forecasting their next year of how much they were going to bottle and sell. And then basically their orders for the year were 0, like quite literally 0, because the supply chain was full. Mm-hmm. And demand, I'm sure if you look at demand for Garrison Brothers, I'm sure more was bought at retail and more was consumed by drinkers, but Garrison Brothers had 0 orders, and that creates needless to say, huge business challenges when. And then coming out of that, now they've had some boom years. So they're totally being hit by the beer game dynamic.
Yeah, and the beer game is a personal favorite of mine. I used to, before I even went to MIT, I was at Chrysler. We actually ran a 5-day system or organizational learning course. Daniel Kim and Diane Corey. Daniel Kim, from a systems thinking standpoint, I put up there with John Sturman and Jay Forster. I love Daniel. He's a fantastic mind. But they came in, and I was basically a co-facilitator with them of this 5-day organizational learning. So there's like 3 or 4 of us that would help with this 5-day event. We would actually run at the Thomas Edison Inn up in Port Huron. And so we ran the beer game. We often ran it in the evening with real beer being served, and that was not a good decision. So, I ran it for several years. I then, of course, took it with systems thinking at MIT, and then I used the simulation, used the design, used the beer game. Actually, did some redesign of the delivery of it, but used that for 15 years. I ran the beer game probably a couple hundred times. And so there's a couple of favorite takeaways for me besides the supply chain aspect. There's 2 aspects of the system design, but also the human element. And I like to distinguish. We talk about systems dynamics, which is what Jay Forster was, and systems thinking. I like to think of systems thinking as drawing pictures. Systems dynamics is doing the math, right? Because there's some real math here. But the impact of delays on the system, the combination of lack of transparency and delays on the system. But then the human element is the decision rules, the heuristics that you use to make decisions within it is always fascinating. And I have so many stories of people choosing really bad heuristics in that system, largely from not understanding the systems or the impact of delays. But it's going back to, I'm sure we'll come back to Toyota, but it's, even their heuristics, right? When are we just in time? When are we not? When are we an exception to the rule? When are we doing something different off, an abnormal condition versus normal condition? Those are all decisions that are made by heuristics that are well informed.
Yeah, and it's tough when you have time delays and lags, and even just having a slow supply chain. So the one thing that these articles, not just the Wall Street Journal, but other publications get they completely misunderstand just in time. They think it means zero inventories and somehow that you can do just in time replenishment from halfway around the world, from literally a slow boat from China. And one thing that was really fun, interesting about this Jack Daniel's documentary is they actually followed from barrel to bottle to shipping container. There was a shipping container with more than 2,000 cases of Jack Daniel's that was on a truck. Then it was on a train going to the port of Charleston, South Carolina. It went onto a huge shipping boat that went down through the Panama Canal, and it went all the way to New Zealand and then to Australia. And then they showed the 2 cases being put on a truck, a pickup truck, driven to some bar in a tiny town in the outback. If that's how you're getting your Jack Daniels, 10,000 miles, 35 days, that's not just in time delivery.
No.
You can't possibly think of that as being, and they didn't describe it as that in the documentary, but that's a different kind of supply chain altogether. And there are going to be times where they sell that bottle and then they run out and they can't get more for who knows how long.
Right. And that's, using the beer game, right? Come back to decision rules. We actually had teams just by design. We would give them the heuristic of only ordered exactly what is ordered of you, which is actually a not ideal. It's by no means an optimistic rule because you actually are in a small backlog the entire time. You're always behind.
And there's some amplification still.
Still some amplification, but it is muted because everybody uses the same rule.
Right.
And the rule is designed not to have overreaction. And it is one of the best performances you can have by following that rule. But it's not the optimal outcome, right? And one of the main reasons for these things are, even your decision rules as well, it depends on what order of magnitude, right? So just in time, over a 10 to 20% variance in demand is very different than a 2 to 400%, or in the cases of things like masks or other things that people have not just healthcare related pandemic stuff, but office furniture, home office furniture, and laptops and webcams and things like that. Sometimes a 1,000 or 2,000% increase. Well, just in time isn't meant to operate in those conditions.
I think it's meant to operate, like you said, that 10 to 20% demand swing, and with local short lead time suppliers. Right.
Yeah, with the ability to react to the signal change, right? Over what duration? 5% in a short duration, maybe 20% over a longer duration. But at some point, and again, it depends on the supply chain, you start talking about, new capital, right? So you can't make more vaccines, masks, other things without buying more capital. And that capital isn't, I can maybe hire a new shift, right? If I didn't already have that, right? I can maybe, work on driving some waste out. I can crank up the demand signal a little bit, but I can't buy more capital, right? And even, toilet paper is an example. It takes time. Toilet paper you had the capital of manufacturing plants that made commercial toilet paper was different equipment and different capital equipment that made residential toilet paper.
And so it's not a very flexible design. Yeah.
It wasn't a flexible design, and capital couldn't be redeployed rapidly. And it wasn't, yes, there was hoarding without question, but the shortage wasn't in toilet paper, period. It was in residential toilet paper.
Right.
Because that's where the capital was overextended. And so, again, time horizons is a huge impact on these supply chain designs and just in time that, I think the media needs to understand as they write these stories that help fuel lack of understanding of how supply chains work.
Yeah. So when you talk about, I didn't know that about toilet paper, different equipment, hard to switch over from one to the other or impossible to switch over. And this is where, you look at not just supply chain decisions, but product development and architecture decisions. Toyota and other automakers moving toward more general platform architectures and being able to build a wider variety of different vehicles on the same assembly line becomes a huge advantage. If consumer demand for some reason shifts away from crossover type vehicles and trucks to sedans, that may not happen for a lot of reasons. But let's say if that were to happen, the Toyota plant in San Antonio can build different types of pickup trucks. I don't know how easily they could retool that over to Camrys. So they have, right, I think, more flexibility than they did in the past, but probably still not like this really. I guess they're trying to figure out what's the optimal level of flexibility. You have more time in the auto industry than I did.
Yeah, and so you look at both subcomponent simplification as well as platform simplification. You delay decisions as long as possible so that you have more flexibility up to the last minute. Even if you look at, this is one of my favorite examples, was wire harnesses, which are big and bulky and expensive.
Yeah.
And if you look at all the features on a car, you might actually need like 50 some different wire harnesses. In a lot of cases, we found it was more cost effective just to, reduce the number of wire harnesses so we didn't have the wrong amount. And then you just didn't plug in the feature that somebody didn't order. Right?
Sure.
Like if they were smart enough, they could get in there and just plug it in and they'd have this feature they didn't pay for.
They can't get to it. Yeah.
But they can't get to it without some work and some effort. But it does come at a cost in certain cases. So the airbag, right? The Takata, is it Takata, right? The Takata
that was one of the
airbag
companies.
Situation. Yeah. It was like, there's no reason to have 47 different types of airbags, right? Just like way back when I was at Chrysler, we found we had 17 different black seat belts.
Right.
And I don't know what was worse, the fact that we had 17 or the fact that we only got down to 3 in our reduction. But because a whole bunch of different companies and a whole bunch of different platforms use the same design, once they had a defect in design that they didn't really figure out, it affected a lot of things.
Yeah. General Motors was, I think, for a while notorious about individualizing components because you have engineering groups and product development groups that want to put their stamp on something. There's all kinds of organizational drivers, but they would start consolidating to start thinking across an entire product line of a General Motors portfolio. Back in the day when you had a wider range of brands, why does under the hood the cap that goes on the windshield wiper filler, why does that need to be different on a Saab versus an Oldsmobile versus a Hummer, just to mention a few dead brands? But why have that differentiation? If you look at Toyota and Lexus, there are, I'm sure, a number of things that the driver would never notice and would never care about where the part is identical on a Toyota Avalon versus the equivalent Lexus. But if they were to start getting too cheap and have the Lexus buyer say these knobs and controls in the interior, this is starting to feel like a Toyota. No offense. It's not that Toyotas are cheap, but relatively speaking, right. GM would get criticized for using, they'd say, you pulled from the parts bin, the Chevrolet parts bin for these Cadillac parts, and you're trying to position Cadillac as a premium, and it doesn't feel very premium. That's part of the trade-off there. But it comes back to value is defined by the customer and perception and use, functionality versus appearance and touch.
And so, I think when it comes to, product design and how it affects these supply chain dynamics, an interesting, guideline or rule of thumb or heuristic is, always simplify where possible, right? But not at the expense of customer value, right?
Right.
So you talk yourself into the added variation rather than have to talk yourself out of it as a general rule. But then, you also have supply chain design, and you already talked about these long supply chain designs, which are inherently inflexible, right? Now, if you're bottling stuff and you're trying to meet a year's worth of demand plus or minus 40% because you don't, the product doesn't spoil on the shelf. Okay. Right. But if you do have expiration of orders or expiration of product, you need to be more flexible. I think one of my favorite, interesting twists on a supply chain design was a company doing a product, designing a product that they did make in China. It was injection molded. It was lots of components. It was, filled out in a box. And so it was one of these that, typically got made in somewhere in Asia. I don't really remember if it was China. And it was for a season, which meant they had to kind of get it right. But what they did was they made their 80% factory order from China, and then saved 20% of the demand for U.S. production. So they could kind of see where demand really was, and then dial in at the last minute locally, right? And so that supply chain, there's lots of different ways to do it, but people underestimate the ability to respond and how time affects the ability to respond to the market.
Yeah. Well, and I think there are systems, right? So just in time and the Toyota production system is not just one piece, right? So there are all these different decisions and aspects of the company that go hand in hand. You get in trouble if you try to copy just one part of the system. But I think of when it comes to differentiation and what have you, I'm looking at devices I have with me. iPhone. This is an iPhone 12 Pro. I think I'm quite certain that the iPhone 11, or at least going back a couple of generations, the Pro and the regular were slightly different sizes. And you think, why? So I'm sure it's a huge advantage. The 12 and the 12 Pro are now the exact same size. So that means advantages when it comes to producing cases. There's greater economies of scale when it comes to that. I'm sure there's greater economies of scale when it comes to the production of cases, right? And you can see, with the phone insert, I've got 3 cameras, which makes it one of the things that makes it a Pro. The iPhone regular has 2 cameras, but I'm sure that inset is the exact same size, right? So that one part of the component is different, but the overall size of it is the same, which I'm sure at some point somebody said, wait a minute, why the hell do we have 2 slightly, not big enough or small enough where it would make a difference to the consumer? It was just annoyingly different. And why?
And Apple, has a history of not worrying about, whether the customer can find the right case or any of those things. Yeah. They kind of worry about their own optimization. Now, Steve Jobs used to say he wants all of his entire product lineup to fit on one conference room table. He wanted simplicity. He didn't want, he would be, I think, driven crazy by some of the product proliferation that's happened within Apple. And whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant. It's just inconsistent with his strategy. And he wasn't really thinking about supply chain dynamics, but more about, designing it what's right for the customer and then just declaring that it's right. But, Apple has a very different, they're not just in time, right? They're big on release day demand, right?
Big bursts.
I don't know what the percentage is, but the percentage of phones that are sold on release day is significant. And perhaps less significant than it used to be, but with lines around the block for people to get the latest product, but they would try to produce all this stuff and get the inventory staged and be ready, and then all in one day, demand, boom, is wiped clean, and then they continue to sell until they surge the market again. But their supply chain isn't designed. We could argue whether that's lean or not, but it's intentional. It's certainly not just in time, because it's an intentional supply chain design.
Yeah. And you make me wonder what you were saying about the wire harnesses. And I'm looking at my MacBook Pro, which is a version of the MacBook Pro that has 2 Thunderbolt ports on each side. There's a total of 4. The less expensive MacBook Pros only have 2 on the left-hand side. The case, the aluminum body, the form factor is exactly the same. It makes me wonder if the motherboard on the inside is exactly the same, but it's just a matter of they drilled 2 more holes in the aluminum to make those ports accessible.
Well, and you'll see.
I don't know.
Yeah, these are design questions, because somebody other than Apple would drill them out on all the units and then put plugs in, right? Apple would say absolutely not. But you see that with cars all the time. It's like, what are those 2 circles there? Oh, that's where the license plate holder goes for states that have a front license plate, or that's where you hook up the bike rack or something like that.
I think one other example, my vehicle, when you go to put gas in, there's obviously the gas nozzle, and then to the left there's a hole that's kind of like covered up, and I think that would be for the diesel version of it. That would be where you add the fluid, the special fluid that you also have to occasionally add for diesel emissions. Yeah, so they just covered it,
right? And this is, again, the simplicity of your product. It leads to the simplicity of your supply chain design. My wife used to drive a Honda Pilot, which now my 2 older kids share. That word share, I could have a whole podcast on that. But when we bought the Honda Pilot, there was 3 different trim levels, and there were like 4 dealer options, which are basically things that they were pre-drilled for, and they could just plug in the fog lights or plug in the pop on the roof rack.
Yeah.
And that was it. And so when the dealership didn't have the specific unit we wanted, there were 3 at other dealerships within the region. And so it was a piece of cake. Now, when I order my German car, the product option list from the factory is so complex. I would ask the salesman about a feature. He's like, I don't know what that is. I haven't seen that. It's so complex that even the guy selling it doesn't understand it. And that's why they have then a 4 to 8 month delay on getting you what you want. And maybe, again, on that German manufacturer, maybe that's part of the value add. They're trying to optimize value, but it leads to other impacts in the supply chain dynamics, including massive delays, whereas that Honda is not trying to optimize value. They're trying to optimize convenience, perhaps, and cost for that customer that can get what they want when they want it.
And the final thing I wanted to bring up about supply chain dynamics, the other end of the beer game, going from glut or from shortages, is going to glut. So a year ago, it was very difficult to find masks, hand sanitizer, cleaning wipes. Go to any grocery store now and you see basically buy one, get one free, buy 2 for the price of 1. Like, they can't give some of this away. And that's only what we're seeing at the very front face of the retail channel. I can only imagine how much there is now sitting in inventories that's now impossible to move.
Yeah, I mean, and this was one where the supply chains did change. It wasn't buying new capital. It was redeploying capital that other people owned into the market, right? So every vodka and gin producer started making, hand sanitizer or other sanitizer products, alcohol-based sanitizers. Every clothing manufacturer made masks. I actually have. I don't want to say I'm not really embarrassed to say, but I have Brooks Brother masks. They actually weren't they were extremely cheap, and I was I was ordering something anyway, and they almost came along with the order. So it was early on in the process, but
it's bad for the brand if they're cheap or scratchy or uncomfortable or something.
They weren't bad, and they're not branded, right? They don't it's not like I've seen Louis Vuitton masks. I'm like, wow, okay, that's pretty obvious. But yeah, there's masks everywhere. We have way more masks at this point than we could use, and in part trying to find the right ones. Like I had a hard time finding masks that wouldn't fog my glasses, and ultimately failed. Right in the winter, when working hard, I basically had to go to anti-fog spray for my glasses. I never found a mask that really prevented it. I know you can use tape and stuff, but anyway, these things have massive oversupply. Now, there's the inventory, there's also the capital, right? So hopefully capital allocation was shifted, but hopefully new capital wasn't spent. Like, oh, let's go put 3 new factories online to build hand sanitizer, because that capital will never get properly used, and will be a tremendous waste in the supply chain overall.
Yeah. Good for equipment makers. And good for somebody.
Good for equipment makers, sure. Yeah. Which many of them are very busy shifting to trying to react to either the good economy or just shift to shifting demands in certain markets. A lot of equipment manufacturers are significantly delayed right now. A lot of equipment you got to wait 18 months for. But yeah, it's interesting how much hand sanitizer might be sitting on shelves. Is it a 12-month supply or on the same order of magnitude as the market, as the undersupply or demand increases? Is there 1,000% oversupply?
12-month supply based on what demand rate? Because like now that a couple of factors, I'm vaccinated. We've learned a lot more about surfaces. Like you don't have to be so worried about touching surfaces and picking up virus and getting yourself sick. I try to wash my hands, but I use far less hand sanitizer. Like I've always had a pump bottle the last year in the cup holder of the vehicle. Just habit, getting in the car, pump, hand sanitize. I'm not doing that as much, and I probably don't need to be doing it as much. And when that thing is empty, I don't know if I'm going to replace it. Maybe I'll leave one in the glove box for more of a just in case instead of daily use purposes. So usage is down and inventories are up, and maybe some of that can go into a strategic stockpile for, God forbid, we hopefully don't have another pandemic in our lifetime.
But it's interesting. Stockpiles are interesting because they require expense to manage as well, right? And it depends on what
creates
it is.
Risk,
right? We have a strategic oil reserve. We have a strategic milk reserve, all powdered milk, right? But it could supply us in extreme conditions, and that's old laws that you go back to World Wars,
Cold War, especially,
But you I know you did a podcast with Dr. Burns from MIT, and you guys talked a little bit about the whole idea of reserves and how do we stockpile stuff. Well, we probably remember we had a ventilator reserve, but the contract to maintain the equipment expired and didn't get renewed, and so then we owned ventilators, but they didn't work.
Right. And there's
and
risk
so
of
how much
there's
do you
all
have
kinds
to
of
move
risk.
stuff around? All kinds of risks, and so it's it's not a simple answer. And again, it depends on order of magnitude. Do I need to stockpile a 2-month supply, 12-month supply, 5-year supply, and under what demand?
Yeah.
And at what cost?
Because you think it's a 5-year supply, and then demand skyrockets, and now it's a 6-month supply.
Exactly. Right. So we saw that with ventilators, right, where we thought we had a strategic supply. It turns out not so much. And what would happen with oil if there was now? Again, we've shifted the oil production in a very different way, but preceding that, if there was a world war, right, what would happen to the strategic oil reserve?
Well, you look at the responsiveness, a year ago, almost exactly, there was this huge push for General Motors and other companies to start building ventilators. And I think by the time those ventilators were built, medicine was realizing, no, we shouldn't be throwing people on ventilators right away.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how many of those ventilators really ended up being put to use. Like, clearly, there are some patients who end up on a ventilator, but
absolutely.
They started doing less and less of that. So I think then the demand for ventilators had dropped.
Right.
Thank you, General Motors. Thank you for your service. But, to what effect?
Yeah. And so, lots of people, again, tried, the gin companies making hand sanitizer. What we knew at the time, it was a good decision, right? I mean, if using hand sanitizer might have a positive impact on stopping some spread, it was worth making extra hand sanitizer and getting it out there. I don't think that was a bad call based on the science we knew at the time, but the long-term outcome was we learned more, and the demand changed, and so so now we have an oversupply, and it's one of those things that we have to be thinking about in supply chains all the time. The design of the product, the design of the supply chain, and the decision rules, the heuristics you use within that, right, and how you react along the way.
And so we'll link to some of these different articles and that podcast I did in my Lean podcast series with Dr. Jonathan Burns, and some other things that you might want to read, even if we ended up not touching on it in depth. So normally when we do podcasts in the evening, it starts to get sleepy time. Here, my stomach, I'll admit, my stomach is growling. So I'm ready for breakfast, because all I've had so far is coffee. So maybe we'll sort of wrap things up on a fun question note. How about that? Our closing fun question as we try to do. So
absolutely.
And I was going to say also, like, you were starting to break up a little bit, and I was going to say, like, you're running out of Wi-Fi, which is not how that works. So I'm going.
Yeah, well, that's another supply chain dynamic that doesn't always have a rapid change, right?
Yeah.
Laying new pipes out for your
refill your Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
But so I think the fun question we were going to talk about, I'll throw it to you first, Jamie. Besides coffee, what's your favorite thing that you experience in the morning in terms of routines or just something you enjoy?
Yeah, so I do I do love sitting out here in the morning when I can. I'm really glad the weather's changed, and I'll enjoy the morning birds. I'm sure some of the bird sounds came through my mic, but
kind of soothing.
Yeah, I don't think that's it's not like traffic or car sirens like I had a meeting on Friday with, but yeah, I love. I mean, along with my coffee, I love. I've actually learned to significantly reduce my news consumption, and more importantly, compress it to, a batch essentially, right? So I basically read very neutral news sources in the morning, almost always The Economist, and then usually Reuters. But I will, when I can, sit out here with my coffee, usually my espresso at that point, and catch up on The Economist. And and I just feel like it opens up my mind to what's going on in the rest of the world. It's not very few of the news articles are things I need to react to, but it connects me to the bigger world, and sort of make sure my mind is sort of big picture rather than little picture. And, just my next meeting, right? It's like, no, here's the world I belong to. And it's a big part of my ritual at this point. And my, and I enjoy the heck out of it.
Yeah. I have always been a newspaper reader, even as a kid. In college, I got the paper, the Chicago Tribune, delivered to the dorm, and read that very regularly. I'm now in an iPad news consumption mode, so I try to minimize my cable news time of any of the channels. Just a lot of arguing, and I feel like I get a better read of the news from different sources. So I'll read on the iPad a range of New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Being in LA, I've been reading, subscribed to the LA Times, mainly for local news coverage around, the pandemic, and things now are getting better, knock on wood, in LA County. But, when I'm in Los Angeles, we're really fortunate to be in a condo that's close enough to the water, close enough to the one marina, where in the morning as the sun is coming up, and especially on a clear morning, the ocean looks very, very blue when the sky is very clear. Like on a cloudy day, the ocean looks like the sky. But one thing that's been a real blessing in this year is being able to enjoy Monday morning looking outside at the water. That's something I realize that's a real privilege and a blessing to be able to enjoy, but I'm thankful for that. Cup of coffee, iPad, and
it's usually
a view.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, a view of any sort, but I don't live on a lake, but any chance I get to get a morning still lake is just this clear crystal, still lake that's highly reflective. Those are fantastic. So I can appreciate that.
Yeah. When we were in Orlando, I would walk around Lake Eola, which, a downtown lake. It was a sinkhole at some point. It's Florida. They turned it into a lake with a beautiful fountain. And like you said, on a really still water morning, some of the downtown buildings and things just reflecting off. There's something about looking at water. I don't know what in our DNA makes that enjoyable, but that seems to be something people enjoy.
It does. Very peaceful, and in another way reminds you that you're part of a much, much bigger world. So.
Good thing to be
reminded
so let's
wrap things up, I guess.
All right. So thank you for listening. You can find all past episodes at leanwhiskey.com. You can spell whiskey with a K-E-Y or a K-Y at the end, leanwhiskey.com. That'll forward to my website. If you would rather go to Jamie's website, it is...
Yep. Yeah, you can find me at jflinch.com/leanwhiskey. You find the same feed of podcasts.
Yep. And you can, the main places you can find us, of course, include Apple Podcasts, Spotify. It's now called Google Podcasts. I'm going to update our standard here. It used to be called Google Play. You can find us in all the main podcast directories, and they now say instead of subscribe, the language they use is follow. So please follow, and then we'd also ask you to...
Yeah, follow us, rate us, review us. We really appreciate these small gestures. It helps us, but it also helps other people find it. So we appreciate just a small gesture of a rate, review, or a follow.
And I think next episode we'll be back to whiskey in the evening, right?
Yeah, it's a small detour, but we at least covered whiskey in the news. But it'll be time to return to drinking whiskey. So until then, cheers.
Top of the morning to you. If we had taken just a quick digression before we end, because I wonder sometimes, framing this as lean whiskey, I don't know, maybe that scares off some listeners who say, well, I'm against whiskey. I don't care about whiskey. If we had really framed it as a lean coffee podcast, we might have run out of things to talk about regarding coffee.
Oh, I'm sure. I think this was, I don't want to say the deepest dive, but that I've ever had on coffee. But I would definitely run out. But the wonderful world of whiskey is a much more interesting rabbit hole to dive into.
All right. So until next time, thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. See ya.
See ya.